So this is a follow-up on the Banlist video, which had the most like controversial content based on all the comments, because a lot of people were disagreeing with some of the takes or in the video or some of the other comments. This video is more of like a concepts of a plan explaining different routes that you can take with this deck in Supreme Darkness. It's kind of in the place that Vanadium was at a certain point, where it's very hard to say if one particular build is objectively better than the rest in terms of the engines that you're playing, because there's so many different engines that work relatively well with the deck. Like, you could play just the toy stuff and no Fiendsmith, but I think the Fiendsmith stuff does complement the deck very well. And if you do choose to play A-Bao, which is also coming out in Supreme Darkness, there is a line where I think you probably do need to play something involving sequence, which basically means you're on the Desiree stuff, either instead of or in addition to the Wave Hiking Caesar. I don't know if this is worth playing, but I'm going to show you some stuff you can do with it anyhow, and then some other versions, and also like maybe some of the reasons that you might want to play Moa Regina, which is a little bit more interesting in Supreme Darkness than it is right now. In terms of the like power spell stuff, I still think that Goat is useful, because you could call Detonator, or if you're against Malice, you could play White Binder or something else depending on the board they've gone for, but White Binder can be quite hard to play around depending on the board you're interacting with. With the Fiendsmith stuff, I wanted to have as few bricks as possible in the deck, and Sanct is the full Wave Hiking combo, so even though it's like in quotes the worst of the cards to draw, I'd rather not have an additional normal summon like Lurie when the Lacrima is already something that conflicts with your normal, even though it's not like really a brick. Stellar is a card that I maybe want to take out of the deck, because if you're not on the toy box stuff, it's much easier to interact with this card, and your opponent knows, because if you've sent like a soldier or a tank, it's already in the grave, it's gone there for cost, so they know if they're, you know, if you're still going to resolve the soldier, and if you have box up or whatever. But if you send something that's not particularly useful, then they know that it's much higher value for them to interact with this card. And because of the Azamina LZ, Sylvia is by far a better summon, because you almost always have access to Azamina LZ, and that still goes into almost the full combo anyhow. And because you have an additional level 2 in Supreme Darkness, you don't have issues with climbing into Diabel, so it's not really like you need the Stellar. But if you were on the toy version, then maybe you'd want to play this at 3 again, or at least still play some of it. The last thing is that I am testing this card, which I don't think is like a very good card in terms of resource economy, but if you're not playing the toy cards, what you'll find is that you want to have White Forest cards that reset themselves with different names as often as possible, because that way you still go through an efficient resource loop. And so I will show this in some of the lines in a minute. And yeah, I won't spend too much time on anything else. So I have some replays against some real people who are bad enough that you can just consider these bot games. Here I draw like a statistically somewhat normal hand where I have 2 non-engine, so there's the Droll and the Super Poly in this instance. If you are on Super Poly, you are kind of limited in the rest of your extra deck space, so this is more of just like another option that you can play. So anyhow, the opponent just basically passes on this card. So this is the one that if it's destroyed by battle and sent to the grave, he can pop a card, and then if I target it, he can discard a card from my hand. So it's not, you know, much. So here I activate the Wanted, and you usually only do that if you're going to start with the Witch, so you would never sequence it this way, because if you get Drolled, you would just chain the Wanted to the Droll. But anyhow, so here I use the LZ, and I have an extender here with the Azamina LZ, so it doesn't really matter what happens to the Sylvie, but it resolves and it searches for the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest. And then I can summon the Azamina LZ and bring out the Silvera, which will book this card, so now he's not going to be able to check if I'm targeting it or whatever. And I search for the Deception, and then the Deception can pop the Witch in hand to get the Hallowed Azamina, which can bring out Sol and pop the card. And the reason for showing this replay is if you played Shaddolls in the past, you notice that just having a quick play fusion card enables many OTKs that were never possible before. So this is not like an impressive game, but it shows you that, for example, you attack, you will almost always have this Sylvie or Rusia to bring out, preferably the Sylvie for OTK because it's 1500, and then you can still fusion after that, and then, you know, well, the opponent scoops before it resolves, but whatever you bring out is obviously going to have more than 1300 attack, so it's a lot easier to OTK with like Silvera and stuff like that now. Another quick replay that I'll show you, I have 2 others after this, is so you start with the Sanct, and this will almost always check for Requiem. It can't check for Droll, obviously, but it makes it like easier if you have if you're gonna go for like an Azamina LZ or sorry, like a regular LZ line. So they ash that, which is fine. You have to start with this anyhow, because of the requirement where you have to have no face-up monsters or they have to all be Light Fiend. So you will just always start with that. It's not really like a restriction. So then we normal summon the Sylvie and the Ogre, because if you like before, if you had a Rusia in hand or what, and you've used your normal, then you don't really have a way to extend because you don't have a name on board. But in many of these cases, it doesn't really matter because you can special the Azamina LZ off its own effect, and now you control a white forest so the Rusia can come out. So the Ogre play is like understandable, I guess, because there maybe are not super optimal places to Ogre the deck aside from on Deception maybe, but that usually comes a little bit later or earlier depending on exactly what you've drawn. So that doesn't stop the deck from doing anything. And then the more different names of White Forest stuff you have, the easier it is to cycle through your resources without needing the toy stuff. So here we search for the LZ. You can go into the Ursiela here, and you have the other two, as I was mentioning, in the LZ. So there's no issue with going into the A-Bao whenever you want. And so again, this is not like the most amazing replay, but it's just to show that like it doesn't actually matter if your opponent hits you with two low impact hand traps with the deck built the way that it is, because you haven't even used LZ at this point. And like in the absolute worst case scenario, you at least have like a A-Bao that can bring out a Silvera, you have an Unleashing, and you have a Sinful Spoils of the White Forest to bring out whatever in your opponent's turn. Now let me show you some more interesting stuff. Let me show you, if you were playing A-Bao, why you might want to, or like some ideas of things that you could do. So here, if you go for the Deception line, and I'm really like not playing this in a particular order, I'm just showing you what the resource loop can look like. So you always want to have Azamina LZ in rotation because that will always give you the Wanted, and even if you already had access to Deception, it's way better to have access to Deception with Wanted because you have an additional card, as opposed to not having that additional card from the Wanted draw. So here you Diabel, and I'm just like trying to force myself to use this card as much as possible to show why it might be useful or not. So I'm adding this back off of Diabel. And so here I've set the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, and Rusia gives me a draw. This is really just to put the Wanted in the grave because we already have access to Deception. We do have like two Wanteds here, but whatever, it's just like a resource that I've searched for the draw. So here we make the Ilia Sylvia, and then we go into the we're not going to go into the wave hiking line here. So the reason that you would do it this way is, let me explain like a couple of things here. So when the Rusia or the Sylvie hits the field, you at this point will ideally will be searching Unleashing as opposed to Woes. So shuffling back the Ursiela from the grave is not a very major hit to your resource game because you are not shuffling back in your opponent's turn to make sure that Woes resolves. So the Unleashing will usually have multiple bounces anyhow because you're also playing the Azamina fusion stuff, but even if you only had one bounce, like your opponent still is going to know that you have Unleashing all the time because you've either searched it, or even if you hard drew it, you would use it as a fodder for something, and so not only would they know that you'd hard drawn it and then sent it, but they'd know exactly where you set it. So it's not like there's like big brain stuff to play like around that. Your opponent will always try to play around it if possible. So ideally you'll have like an Unleashing. You might also have like a Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, and so shuffling back that Ursiela from the grave is not like the worst thing in the world. Now you have a sequence which is worth 2 link materials, which is very important, and then you have 2 other materials that can go into the link 4. So here we have an Ilia Sylvia, and we have a Rusia that we just brought out. Now if we turn that into A-Bao, you may be wondering, why would you get rid of your own Omni Negate? And I don't think that this is like the best way to do the combo, but what you can do is the sequence hasn't been used yet, so you would sequence equip it to the Desiree, which is fine. You would always want to use the sequence as a material before equipping it, rather than just doing it for free and losing that link 2 rating here. But then the A-Bao, maybe I should go over this. So this is 2+ monsters, including a Fiend monster. So that's important because, for example, the sequence is a Fiend monster. So during the main phase, so this is anyone's main phase, the quick effect is you can discard a card and then activate one of the effects, and that is a cost, which means that this will trigger all of the like White Forest cards. So usually, if you have like Tails in your hand, because you added it back and that's the thing that you're sending, this will trigger that and it will reset itself. So you can either destroy a card on the field, which is non-targeting, or you can banish itself until the end phase. And if you do, special summon a light or dark monster from your grave. So you don't lose the Ilia Sylvia, and because this only banishes until the end phase, you get to do the same thing or the destruction effect on your opponent's turn. So really, you didn't lose the sequence because it was being equipped here anyhow. You didn't lose the Ilia Sylvia because it was brought back anyhow. You only lose the Arciela resource in the grave that allowed Rusia to bring itself out. So then, you know, let's say we get our wanted draw, doesn't really matter. The A-Bao comes back in the end phase. And now, ideally, in the opponent's turn, like what you would typically do is you would sequence it so that you would like Desiree negate something, okay? And then in an ideal situation, your opponent would do something and you would A-Bao, send the sequence, which is currently treated as a spell or trap card, and then you would bring out like a Silvera, okay? So you would already have used the Desiree and you would already have used the A-Bao in this like made up scenario. And you would not have lost any resources. And what you can do is you can use Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, and you can fuse using the Diabel and the Fiendsmith Desiree. So the Sol requires an illusion monster and a fiend monster, and the Diabel is an illusion monster, and obviously the Desiree is a fiend monster. So when you create your new chain, the Sol will be able to pop one. Wait, is this pop or send? It sends. And the Desiree, where is it, will also be able to send. So you have like a double send in the same chain that you can chain block if that's important. But what makes this play like a little bit better than it seems, aside from what I'm about to show you, is that if you had done what I showed you against a rail player, where you like ideally Desiree and then you Diabel send the sequence, and you've brought out a Silvera, the Silvera is another body on field. So imagine that you have another body here, and the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, this doesn't care what you fusion summon, it just says that you have to use monsters from your hand or field as material. So the Ilia Sylvia is an illusion and a light spellcaster monster. So Silvera is a light spellcaster monster, which means that you can use the Silvera like after it's already been summoned out on the field. Like for example, if you didn't have access to Ilia Sylvia. So the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest is actually quite flexible depending on what your setup is. But the thing that really makes this good is that regardless of whether you use this card, so you know you can bring back the Diabel if you didn't use it, or you could, if there was like a properly summoned Silvera off of Woes or whatever, you could bring that Silvera back because it's a light or dark monster, which means like, you know, it could be a reason to play Woes with this card. So you can Silvera not only with Woes and Diabel, but also with the A-Bao because it will bring the Silvera back. So not only can you do that, but then when it goes back to your turn, you have in the standby phase, you can target an Azamina or Sinful Spoils card in your grave, add it to your hand. So that's one card looped back. So in this case, the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, which is what allows us to fusion summon. And then in the standby phase, this has a separate effect where you can draw cards equal to the number of different monster types among the monsters in your graveyard, which is going to be usually 2 or 3. It could be more. So you draw those cards, and then you place the same number of cards from your hand to the bottom of your deck. So that is like a very strong effect because you're trying to win on the crackback. So if you can like basically mulligan your hand almost, well, better than mulligan, because you're really like choosing after you've drawn the cards what you're going to keep, and then you put back other cards. You now have all of these cards that you can go into again. So for example, like let's say you normal summon a Sylvie, whether or not you resolve the effect, you now have a dark level 6 and a light level 4. So you could make like a Chaos Angel, and you could add back the Hallowed Azamina to your hand by shuffling back the Sol, and you haven't used Sol's pop effect on your turn. So you can bring out the Sol, for example, again with Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, and because it's a Sinful Spoils card, you could chain it to Hallowed Azamina, so that this is being sent for free. And so you would get the Sol, and then you'd also get whatever the other card was that you wanted out off of the Azamina Murcielago, or off of the Hallowed Azamina, sorry. So, and then, you know, you just like continue your play. And so that shows that like the resource loop is actually very strong with this deck, even if you don't use the toy cards. And the A-Bao can help you with that. But it does require like a slightly awkward setup sometimes. Where you kind of like want the sequence, because otherwise you're not link climbing, or maybe you would want to play the toy cards to make it easier to link climb, or like a Celine package or something, but you're really like crunch for space if you play the Fiendsmith stuff. Okay, the last thing that I want to show is the why Moa Regina may or may not be useful. So here, again, I'm on the Sanct version. So I bring out the token, and that can go into the Requiem and bring out the Lacrima, which will dump another engraver. And here we bring out the Necroquip, and then the engraver brings itself out. And so we, here at this point, have either been nibbed, because we've checked for it, or they don't have nib probably, or they have like a combination of hand traps. So here we are going to search. Remember, so this card says that you add an Azamina card, and why this is good is because this is an Azamina card, so you don't have to search for Hallowed Azamina. You can just always search Azamina LZ depending on what's in your hand. And again, you're in this scenario that comes up quite often where you don't need to use your normal. You can Azamina LZ bring itself, and then the Rusia now can special summon itself. And so here we get a free draw from the Deception because we don't really need it right now. And then we can Arciela and Azamina LZ search. And again here, I'm just trying to force myself to use this card to see whether or not it's worth playing or not. And again, you don't need the Estelar to ladder into the A-Bao because you haven't even used your LZ at this point to make the Arciela. And then this is very, very typical with most hands of this deck. The Sinful Spoils of the White Forest resets itself, and then you make the A-Bao, and that adds back, in this case, like our non-engine. It could be any card, but it happens to be super poly here. So here we search for the Unleashing, which is, again, because you can get to it through different engines, because it's both White Forest and Azamina, I think it's better than Woes, but I would probably still side one Woes for going first. Okay, so now we get the draw, which is whatever, and so here is an end board that doesn't look particularly aggressive, but it is quite layered, because we have the main, one of the most powerful interactions here in the Wave Hiking Caesar. This will hit stuff like Ice Rise Eels effect to special from deck. It will hit like the Malice cards trying to special themselves off of Banished or whatever. We have a A-Bao on field, and then we have like follow up in the grave because we have a Rusia that can bring itself out. We have the LZ of the White Forest, which is going to add itself back. And then we have the Unleashing, which was searched, the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, which was searched, and whatever our non-engine card was. And then we also have whatever's in our hand. So, let's say that, so the thing that's a little bit awkward about showing this combo is that you have to have like a real opponent for this deck to make sense. Going through just random combo lines doesn't really show what would happen if you were playing against the person. But if you were playing the Fiendsmith stuff, one thing that is worth remembering, that you must remember, is the Lacrima can shuffle itself back to bring out the Requiem in your opponent's turn. And because Requiem is a quick effect, it can bring out the Engraver. And the Engraver is a fiend, but it is also a level 6. So if you read Moa Regina, it has to have an illusion monster and a level 6 or higher fiend monster. So for example, you could use Sinful Spoils of the White Forest, and your illusion could be the A-Bao Queen of the White Forest. I guess it technically could be Azamina LZ, but I think it's more realistic with your end board, it would be A-Bao. And this would usually be after it's used this effect and maybe brought out a Silvera. And then the Fiendsmith Engraver, which on your follow-up, because you always, when you look at these combos, you can't just look at them in a vacuum. You have to think about what the resource cycle is going to be. On your turn, on the crackback, the Engraver will be able to special summon itself out by shuffling back the Requiem, and that's potentially like a Chaos, like half of a Chaos Angel. So we bring out the Moa Regina. The problem with this card, the main restriction of this card, is that this is the exact opposite of a layered interruption. So this says, when an Azamina or Sinful Spoils card or effect is activated besides itself, you can target up to 2 cards on the field and destroy them. So this card is one of the best Sinful Spoils cards that you could use to be able to trigger this, but because it's a spell, you can't do it on your opponent's turn. You'd have to do it on your own turn. And you have used this to bring out the Moa Regina, so you can't Moa Regina in response to the Sinful Spoils of the White Forest. You could, like, I guess Unleashing and chain the Moa Regina to the Unleashing, but that's just not like an efficient use of your resources. Usually you want to force your opponent to commit as much as possible before using the interruptions. You technically can, let's say you wait until it's your turn, and this is where I think Moa Regina is probably a lot more useful, is that you summon it on your own turn, and this is basically like a crackback card. It's not like a boss monster or like an interruption or an end board piece. So the first thing that you can do with this card is you can target an illusion monster in your grave besides itself and special summon it. So here we could bring out a A-Bao, for example, but it could be anything else. It could be like an Ilia Sylvia that you used on your opponent's turn, because this is an illusion and this doesn't have to be fusion summoned to be able to have its Omni negate. So your first action of the main phase 1 can be getting back a A-Bao or an Ilia Sylvia. Those are probably the most likely things for this to reborn, but it could also be an Azamina LZ, because this is also an illusion, and then you can re-ladder that way. You know, because you could imagine that if you bring this out and you shuffle back like the A-Bao to bring out like a Sylvie, you can just start the ladder all over again. So this is very, very useful for the resource cycle on the specifically on the crackback. So not on your first turn and not on your opponent's turn, but specifically on the crackback. And then also on the crackback, it will be a lot easier to have any kind of Azamina or Sinful Spoils card to activate. For example, if you had another Wanted in your grave, or if you had saved the Wanted for the crackback because you didn't need the draw, or whatever the reason is, you could save that, and then the Moa Regina would be able to give you the pops. So I think this is heavily worth considering if your playstyle is focusing on the crackback, which I think is like a big part of what the deck can do. But this is not my actual list for now. I haven't decided yet exactly what ratios I'm going to play. I think that if you do play both the Wayfight King Caesar and the Desiree and the sequence, it takes up too much of your extra deck space. And like, you don't even have space for a Zapper Shrimp and a target besides Chaos Angel. So, and you also don't have space for the Moa Regina if you do that. Whereas if you were to just play the Sanct package here, and you weren't on the Desiree stuff and maybe not on the A-Bao stuff, and you're also not playing the toy cards, you could just take out Desiree, take out A-Bao, take out sequence, and then you would have like an easy 3 spots for other stuff, which could be Moa Regina, which also does kind of work with Subversion on the crackback, because you can Subversion target one thing, Moa Regina try to pop 2 other things. So that is the concepts of a plan so far for some ideas that you can try with this deck, which I think will have a million different variants.